She caught the falling ridge beam not with a cry, but with a grunt of effort, her broad shoulders taking the immense weight that would have crushed the child cowering below. If this story moves you, do me a kindness before we go any further. Subscribe to the channel, follow it all the way to the end, because the part that will stay with you comes late, and leave the name of your town down in the comments so we can all watch together how far this story travels. Now let me carry you back to where it truly began. She arrived on a Tuesday, carried by her own 2 feet over the last rise of land. The stagecoach had left her at the crossroads 10 miles back, the driver barely giving her a second glance as she paid her fare and hefted her single, tightly packed carpet bag. The dust of the road had settled into the seams of her plain poplin dress, a garment of no particular color, made to endure rather than to impress. Her name was May, and she had walked a long way in her life, in more ways than one. The valley opened before her, a shallow bowl of land carved by a creek that shone like a dull pewter ribbon under the afternoon sun. And in the center of it, the place she was walking toward, Thorn Creek Ranch. From this distance it looked broken. It looked tired. The main house sagged in the middle, its spine weakened. A barn listed to one side as if weary of standing. Fences traced drunken lines across fields that were more brown than green. It was a place whispering of grief, of neglect born from a pain too deep to manage. She understood the language of such places. She had lived in them before. May was a large woman. It was the first thing people saw, the first thing they noted, the first thing they judged. She was tall for a woman and broad, with a thickness to her bones and a solidity to her flesh that the world had told her, in 1,000 different ways, was wrong. Her bigness, her color, her too-muchness. She had been a spectacle, a curiosity, a target. As a girl, she had tried to shrink, to fold herself into a smaller shape, to take up less space in a world that grudged her every inch. But a mountain cannot pretend to be a molehill. The effort had only brought her pain, so she had learned. She had learned to build armor. The first layer was silence. She learned not to offer her thoughts, for they were dismissed. She learned not to share her feelings, for they were deemed inconvenient. The second layer was a still face, a placid mask that revealed nothing of the quick, sharp mind working behind her dark eyes. It gave no purchase for mockery, no satisfaction for cruelty. It was a wall, smooth and high. The final and most important layer of her armor was competence. She had learned that what people thought of her body mattered less when they needed what her hands and mind could do. She learned to mend what was broken, to tally what was disordered, to soothe what was sick, to build what was fallen. She learned the language of timber and soil, of ledgers and livestock, of engines and wounds. Competence was a currency that, unlike beauty or charm, could not be easily devalued. It was hard and real and useful. She expected to be used, and then, when the using was done, she expected to be discarded. It was the pattern of her life. As she drew closer, her specialist's eye began its silent inventory. The main irrigation ditch from the creek was silted up, its banks eroded. That was why the lower pastures were turning to alkali flats. The supports on the north side of the main barn were rotted at the base. A strong wind from the wrong direction would bring the whole thing down. The small flock of sheep huddled in the shade were afflicted with foot rot. She could tell by the way they favored their legs. It was a litany of decay, a catechism of work left undone. Each problem was a stone in the foundation of the ranch's failure, and she saw them all, clear as day. She felt no judgment, only a quiet, humming recognition. This was a language she spoke fluently. She walked into the main yard, the dust muffling her footsteps. A man was sitting on the porch steps of the sagging house, his head in his hands. He did not look up. He was a tall man, but he was folded into himself, trying to take up less space, just as she once had. His shirt was frayed at the cuffs, and his boots were scuffed and worn. Grief was a cloak he wore, heavy and suffocating. This had to be Elias Thorne. A small girl with hair the color of dry straw peered out from behind a window curtain, her face a pale smudge against the glass. Her eyes were wide and wary, the eyes of a creature that had learned the world was not a safe place. Then she was gone. May stopped a respectful distance from the porch. She waited. The silence stretched, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the tired sigh of the wind through the eaves. Finally, the man lifted his head. His eyes were the faded blue of a summer sky after a long drought, and they were hollowed out by loss. He looked at her, his gaze passing over her without really seeing her, as if she were just another feature of the desolate landscape. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. May did not waste words on pleasantries. They were a currency she did not possess. "Your main irrigation ditch is silted, and the banks are collapsing. You're losing more than half your water to seepage before it reaches the fields. That's why your land is dying." He stared at her. The emptiness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of sharp surprise, then a deep, weary annoyance. He had likely been told 100 things were wrong, by 100 different people. But she had not spoken of debt or despair. She had spoken of silt and water, a specific, tangible problem. He pushed himself to his feet, a slow, aching movement. He was taller than he had looked sitting down, a man built on a large frame who had been whittled down by sorrow. "Who are you?" "My name is May. I was told you might have need of a hired hand." He looked her up and down then, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw her size, her plain dress, her foreign face. She saw the familiar flicker of dismissal in his eyes, the reflexive judgment. She stood perfectly still, her face placid, her armor in place. She waited for the rejection, but he was a man drowning, and she had just pointed to the specific leak in his boat. He squinted, his gaze going from her face to the dying fields and back again. The gears of his mind were turning, slowly, rustily. "Say that again," he said, his voice quiet. "About the ditch." "The head gate is probably clogged with debris from the spring floods," she said, her voice even and calm. "The channel needs to be dug out, and the weak sections of the bank need to be shored up with new timber. Otherwise, you won't have a single blade of grass in that lower pasture by next summer." He was silent for a long time, just looking at her. She did not fidget. She did not look away. She simply stood, a fact, a large, capable, unmovable fact. "The bunkhouse is out back," he said at last, gesturing vaguely with his head. "Food's in the main house. Work starts at sunrise." He turned without another word and went back inside the sagging house, the screen door sighing shut behind him. May took a slow breath. She had not been discarded. Not yet. She picked up her bag and walked toward the bunkhouse, the first small stone of a new life settling into place. The first fix began the next morning before the sun had fully crested the eastern hills. May rose in the cool, gray dark of the bunkhouse, a simple structure of raw planks that smelled of dust and lonely men. She ate a cold biscuit from her bag and went not to the house, but to the dilapidated tool shed. There she found what she needed: a good shovel, a heavy mattock, and a length of rusted chain. Elias Thorne found her an hour later, knee-deep in the cold, sluggish water of the irrigation ditch, mud-smeared to her elbows. She had already cleared a thick knot of tangled branches and river trash that had almost completely blocked the headgate. A trickle of clean water, a new and hopeful sound, was now flowing into the channel. He stood on the bank, a mug of coffee in his hand, watching her. He said nothing. May worked with a steady, relentless rhythm that ate away at the neglect. She swung the mattock with the power of her whole body, breaking up the packed, clay-like silt. She shoveled the heavy mud onto the bank, her movements efficient and strong, wasting no energy. The land talked, and she was answering it. The problem was clear, written in the eroded soil and thirsty roots, and the solution was just as clear. Hard work, honest work. She did not need praise or supervision. The work itself was the conversation. He watched for a solid hour, the coffee growing cold in his hand. He saw that she was not just mindlessly digging. She was reading the flow of the water, shaping the channel to prevent future silting, identifying the sections where the bank was weakest. When she paused to wipe sweat from her brow with the back of a muddy forearm, he finally spoke. "It'll take 2 men a week to clear this channel." "I will have it done in 4 days," May stated, not as a boast, but as a calculation. "If I can have use of the draft horse to drag some logs for shoring." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the clean line she had already carved from the muck. He left without another word, but later that morning, the old draft horse, A tired-looking beast named Samson was tethered near the ditch, waiting for her. It was his first concession, his first quiet admission that she knew what she was doing. During those 4 days, she began to map the silent territories of the Thorne household. The little girl, Sarah, would watch her from a distance. She never came close, a small, pale ghost flitting at the edges of May's vision. May never tried to approach her. She knew that a wounded animal must come to you. She did not try to speak to the child or offer her sweets. Instead, she began to leave things. One afternoon, she spent her short lunch break carving a piece of scrap wood. When she went back to work, she left a small, smooth, perfectly rendered bird on the porch railing. She did not look back to see if the girl took it. The next day, it was gone. The other inhabitant of the ranch was an old man named Jedediah, a man as gnarled and weathered as the fence posts he was supposed to maintain. He had only one arm, the other lost to a sawmill accident years ago, and a disposition soured by time and pain. He watched May with open skepticism, his one good eye narrowed. "Thorne's hiring anyone now, is he?" He'd muttered the first day, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her boots. May had simply looked at him with her still face and continued her work. Jedediah circled her like a wary old coyote, expecting failure. On the third day, she needed to move a heavy, waterlogged cottonwood log to brace a collapsing section of the ditch bank. It was a job for 2 strong men at least. Jedediah stood by, arms crossed, or rather arm crossed, stump resting on his hip, a cynical smirk on his face. "Gonna need the horse for that one, missy," he rasped. May looked at the log, then at the awkward angle of the bank. The horse couldn't get the right purchase. She walked to the log, studied it, and then jammed the end of a smaller, sturdy plank beneath it. She kicked a rock into place as a fulcrum, using the plank as a lever and her own considerable weight and strength as the force she strained. The muscles in her back and shoulders bunched. For a moment, nothing happened. Jedediah's smirk widened. Then, with a great sucking sound from the mud, the end of the heavy log lifted. With a series of grunting, powerful movements, she levered it, inch by agonizing inch, into position. It settled into the bank with a solid, satisfying thud. May stood up, breathing heavily, mud clinging to her. She looked at Jedediah. The smirk was gone from his face. He stared at the log, then at her, and then back at the log. He worked his jaw for a moment. "Huh," he grunted. It was the highest form of praise he was capable of. From that day on, he stopped calling her Missy. He started leaving a bucket of fresh water for her near the ditch before he went about his own chores. It was his concession, his quiet admission. On the 4th day, as promised, the ditch was clear. The water ran swift and clean from the head gate all the way to the parched lower fields. That evening, as May washed the mud from her hands and face at the outdoor pump, Elias Thorne came and stood nearby. "The water is running," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He looked at her hands, which were red and raw, but immensely capable. "I haven't seen it run like that in 3 years." He paused. "My wife, she used to manage the water." It was the first time he had mentioned her, a small crack in the armor of his grief. May simply nodded, drying her hands on a piece of sackcloth. She understood. The ranch was not just failing, it was a monument to his loss. Every broken thing was a memory of the person who used to tend to it. That night, when she went to the main house for her meal, a silent affair of bread and stew left on the corner of the big kitchen table, she found a small object next to her plate. It was Sarah's old doll, its poplin dress torn and one of its button eyes hanging by a thread. There was no note. None was needed. After she ate, May took the doll back to the bunkhouse. By the light of a single candle, with a needle and thread from her own small sewing kit, she mended the dress with tiny, neat stitches. She reattached the button eye, securing it more firmly than it had been before. The next morning, she left the repaired doll on the same porch railing where she had left the carved bird. It, too, was gone by midday. A silent conversation was taking place, a slow weaving of trust where words had failed. She was mending more than just ditches and dolls. She was mending the edges of a broken family. A month passed. May moved through the ranch like a quiet, steady force of nature. She mended the fences Jedediah couldn't manage with one arm. She diagnosed the foot rot in the sheep and Using a remedy her grandmother had taught her, began the slow, smelly process of treating them. She rehung the gate on the main corral so it swung true. With every task completed, the ranch straightened its spine a little more. It began to breathe again. Elias Thorne remained distant, a ghost in his own home. But he watched her. He saw the improvements. He started leaving her pay on the kitchen table every Saturday, without fail. He never said thank you. The words were locked away with his grief, but the pay was there, and the work was there, and for now, it was enough. Then on a bright Wednesday afternoon, the shadow arrived. It came in the form of a polished black buggy pulled by a handsome, high-stepping bay. The man driving it was Mr. Phineas Carmichael, the owner of the town's only bank and sawmill. He was a heavy man, soft in a way that spoke of good food and little labor. He wore a fine wool suit despite the heat, and his face was fixed with a smile that looked as if it had been set there with a trowel, a permanent mask of cheerful benevolence. He pulled the buggy to a halt and climbed down, his movements ponderous. "Elias, my good man," he boomed, his voice as smooth and rich as cream. Elias came out onto the porch, his face tightening. "Carmichael," he said, his tone flat. "Just making my weekly rounds, checking on my investments," Carmichael said, his eyes sweeping over the ranch. He noticed the cleared ditch, the mended fence. His smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I see things are tidier. You found some help." His gaze fell upon May, who was coming from the barn, carrying a heavy sack of feed over her shoulder. He looked her up and down, a slow, appraising glance, the way a man might look at a piece of livestock he was considering for purchase. "Well now," he said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement, "you certainly have found yourself a substantial woman, a sturdy specimen indeed. Good for the heavy work, I imagine." May stopped. The insult, so casually delivered, landed like a physical blow. Specimen, an object, a thing. The old armor, the still face, held firm. She did not flinch or react. She simply met his gaze, her dark eyes unreadable. She had heard variations of this her entire life. This one was no different. It was merely the poison of a different snake. Elias stiffened. A dull flush crept up his neck. "This is May," he said, his voice tight. "She works for me." Of course, Carmichael said, waving a dismissive hand, his attention already moving on. He put a familiar, proprietary hand on Elias's shoulder. "Now, about that note, my friend, we do need to have a conversation about the next payment." The two men went inside. May stood in the yard for a long moment, the weight of the feed sack a familiar comfort on her shoulder. She had seen men like Carmichael before. Men who smiled while they stuck the knife in. Men whose kindness was a weapon. His words had been meant to put her in her place, to remind her that she was nothing more than a beast of burden, but he had also revealed something. He had called the ranch his investment, and he had not liked the sight of it being tidied. That night, a new kind of work began. After the house was dark and quiet, May let herself into the small, dusty room that served as the ranch's office. It was a place Elias avoided, for it had been his wife's domain. The ledgers were on the desk, coated in a fine layer of dust. They were her books, her neat script filling the pages, until it faltered, then stopped altogether 3 years ago. May had never told Elias Thorne that she could read and write English fluently, or that her mind for numbers was as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. It was another tool she kept hidden, another facet of her competence she revealed only when necessary. It was necessary now. She lit a small lamp, its glow a tiny pool of defiance in the dark house. She opened the first ledger. For hours she sat there, her finger tracing the columns of figures. At first it was just a sad story of dwindling profits and rising costs. Then she got to the pages after Elias's wife had died, the pages that documented the loans from Mr. Carmichael's bank. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. The plot was not a single brutal act, but a slow, methodical strangulation. There were loans for feed that, according to the ranch's own inventory, was never delivered. There were freight charges from Carmichael's own sawmill for lumber that was never used. The interest rates were compounded in a way that was deliberately confusing and borderline predatory. Every time Elias had fallen behind, Carmichael had extended another loan, with a smile and a pat on the back. Each act of kindness, another turn of the screw, another shovel of dirt on the coffin of the Thorn Creek Ranch. He wasn't just a banker, he was a vulture, patiently waiting for the body to stop twitching so he could claim the valuable land and its water rights. The sun was a pale rumor in the east when May finally closed the last ledger. She knew the full shape of the trap. She saw its elegant, vicious design. Carmichael's condescending remark had not been just an insult. It had been a mistake. He had looked at her and seen only a beast of burden, a sturdy specimen. He had no idea he had just been assessed by a mind that could dismantle his entire crooked empire, one number at a time. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark, the cold, hard facts settling around her like stones. Now she had to make Elias see. She waited until after the morning chores were done. She found Elias by the corral, staring at nothing, that familiar cloak of grief pulled tight around him. She held one of the ledgers in her hands. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "we need to talk about Mr. Carmichael." He turned to her, his face wary. "What about him?" "He is not your friend," she said simply. "He is robbing you." She opened the ledger and, in her calm, even voice, began to lay out the fraud. She pointed to the phantom deliveries, the inflated charges, the predatory interest. She spoke not of malice but of numbers. Her explanation was as clear and methodical as her clearing of the ditch. It was an undeniable, logical demolition of Carmichael's false friendship. Elias listened, his expression shifting from weariness to disbelief, and then to a deep, stubborn resistance. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, you're wrong. The numbers do not lie," May said. "You don't understand," he insisted, a raw, painful edge to his voice. "When my Mary was sick, the doctor cost so much. I had nothing. Carmichael, he came to me. He gave me the money. No questions asked. He said, 'Pay me back when you can, Elias. We're friends.' He saved us." May looked at him, and for the first time her still face softened with something akin to pity. She saw it then, the hook, the one act of genuine or seemingly genuine kindness that Carmichael had used as the anchor for his entire scheme. It had bought Elias's trust, his loyalty, his blindness. "He did not give you a gift," she said gently. "He bought a key, the key to your ruin. Look at the date of that first loan, and look here." She pointed to a line item 2 weeks later. "He began overcharging you for freight from his sawmill the very next month. He was taking back his gift from the very beginning, with interest you never saw." Elias stared at the page, his face a mask of conflict. The man who had shown him kindness in his darkest hour, and the thief laid bare in the ledger. He could not make them the same person. He looked from the book to May's steady, patient face. He saw no malice there, no agenda. He saw only a quiet, irrefutable truth. He saw the clear ditch, the mended fences, the healthy sheep, the repaired doll. He saw a mountain of evidence of her competence and her strange, silent integrity. He had trusted a smiling predator and doubted a quiet savior. The thought was a bitter pill. He drew a long, shuddering breath, the breath of a man seeing a terrible truth for the first time. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the distance that had always been between them collapsed in that one moment. "All right, May," he said, her name. He had said it before, but not like this. This time it was an acceptance, a surrender, a declaration of allegiance. "All right, what do we do?" Their quiet war against Carmichael began, but the land and the sky had their own plans. That autumn, the storms came early and with a vicious temper. A week of cold, hard rain turned the ranch into a sea of mud. The creek swelled, its brown water churning with debris. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, testing every nail, every plank, every foundation on the ranch. The crisis came on a Thursday night. A loud crack, like a gunshot, ripped through the sound of the storm. Jedediah, who had been checking on the horses, came running toward the house, or as fast as a one-armed old man could run through ankle-deep mud. "The barn!" he yelled, his voice thin against the wind. "The north roof! It's going!" Elias and May ran out into the maelstrom. In the flashes of lightning that tore across the sky, they saw it. The main support beam on the north side, the one whose base May had noted as rotted on her very first day, had finally given way. The roof was sagging ominously, groaning under the assault of the wind and rain. And inside that barn were not just the horses, but Sarah. She had gone in earlier to comfort her pony, frightened by the storm, and had not come out. "Sarah!" Elias roared, his voice cracking with terror. He lunged for the door, but May grabbed his arm, her grip like iron. "No! The whole thing is unstable. If you go in, it could all come down." Another groan echoed from the structure, a deeper, more final sound. The ridge beam, the central spine of the entire roof, was shifting. "My daughter is in there," he cried, struggling against her hold. "I know," May said, her voice a strange calm in the heart of the chaos. She looked from Elias's terrified face to the groaning barn. In that moment, she made a calculation, not of numbers, but of weight and time and risk. "Get the child, I will hold it." Before he could process her words, she was moving. She ran not into the barn, but alongside it, to the spot where the main support had failed. Inside, they could hear Sarah's terrified crying. Elias, galvanized by May's command, scrambled through the smaller side door. May found a heavy, discarded timber and, using it as a prop, wedged it under the sagging roof truss. It was a temporary measure, a single desperate prayer against gravity. She could hear Elias inside, his voice calling for his daughter. Then she heard the terrible splintering sound from above. The ridge beam was breaking. She did not hesitate. She kicked the prop away and launched herself into the breach, positioning her own body directly under the failing junction of the truss and the wall plate. She planted her feet wide in the mud, bent her knees and pushed upward with her shoulders and back, her arms braced against the wall. She became a human pillar. The weight that came down on her was immense, a crushing, grinding force that drove the air from her lungs. A grunt of pure, primal effort was torn from her throat. It was the weight of 100 years of timber, of countless winter snows and summer suns. It was the weight of a dying ranch, and she held it. The muscles in her legs and back screamed in protest. Black spots danced in her vision, but she held. Her too-muchness, her bigness, her solidity, the things for which the world had scorned her, were now the only things standing between life and death. Through the roaring in her ears, she heard Elias's shout. He came scrambling out the side door, Sarah clutched in his arms. The little girl was sobbing, her face buried in her father's shoulder. Elias turned and saw her. He saw May, braced against the wall, her face a mask of inhuman strain, holding up the collapsing roof of his world. "May!" he screamed. "Go!" she gasped, the single word all she could spare. He ran, carrying his daughter to the safety of the house. Jedediah, his face pale with awe, was already grabbing ropes and another horse. But the moment stretched. May felt her strength failing, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint. The timbers above her groaned their final complaint. Just as her knees began to buckle, Elias was back. He was not alone. He had rallied Jedediah and two neighbors drawn by the commotion. With ropes and horses and desperate, shouted commands, they managed to brace the roof, to pull it, to secure it just enough. The immediate pressure on May lessened. She stumbled back, falling to her knees in the mud, gasping for air, her body trembling violently from the strain. The storm raged on, but the immediate danger had passed. Elias knelt in the mud beside her, ignoring the wind and the rain. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment, and then he placed it on her shoulder. It was not a proprietary touch, not a master to a servant. It was a touch of pure, unadulterated awe. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than the distance of an employer. His hand was warm, and it anchored her to the trembling earth. He said nothing. He didn't have the words. But his touch, there in the heart of the storm, said everything. It said, "You saved us." It said, "I see you." The storm broke, but another was brewing. Phineas Carmichael, realizing that the ranch was not collapsing as quickly as he'd planned, shifted his tactics. He could not attack Elias Thorne directly, not without revealing his hand. So he attacked May. The whispers started in town, like a foul smoke seeping from the doors of his bank. They spread like fire through dry grass. Who was this strange, large Chinese woman living out at the Thorn place? An unmarried woman, living unchaperoned with a widower. It was unseemly. It was a scandal. Rumors about her being an opium fiend, a witch, a woman of loose morals, circulated in the general store and the church sewing circle. Her competence was twisted into cunning, her silence into secrecy, her strength into something unnatural and threatening. Carmichael cultivated the fear and prejudice of the town, watering it with insinuation and sanctimonious concern. The attack found its champion in Mistress Eleanor Albright, the wife of the town reverend and the undisputed leader of its decent women. Mistress Albright was a woman forged in righteousness, but her armor was cracked by a private grief. She had lost her only son to a fever years ago, a loss that had left her brittle and fiercely protective of the town's moral fabric. Incited by Carmichael's carefully planted seeds of outrage, she saw it as her Christian duty to intervene. She arrived at the ranch one afternoon, her own buggy far less grand than Carmichael's, but far more formidable. She was a small, stern woman in a dress of dark bombazine, and she marched up to the porch where May was mending a piece of harness. "I am Mistress Albright," she announced, foregoing any greeting. "I have come to speak with you about the deplorable situation here." May looked up from her work, her hands still. She recognized the woman's pain before she recognized her purpose. She saw the deep, settled grief in her eyes, a grief so similar to Elias's, but hardened into a weapon instead of a shroud. "There is a child in this house," Mistress Albright continued, her voice sharp with judgment, "a motherless girl, and your presence here, in this arrangement, is a stain upon her welfare and a disgrace to this community." May did not rise to the bait. She did not defend herself. The old armor was in place, but beneath it, something else stirred. Not anger, but a deep, resonant empathy. She put down the harness and looked at the woman, her gaze direct and profoundly gentle. "You lost a child," May said. It was not a question. The statement struck Mistress Albright with the force of a physical blow. Her righteous fury faltered. Her face, so set and stern, crumpled for a bare second. I don't see what that has to do with anything." "It has to do with everything," May said, her voice soft. "It is why you are here. You see a motherless child and your heart aches. You want to protect her from a world that you know can bring unbearable pain. You believe you are protecting her from me." She stood up, her large frame casting a long shadow, but there was no threat in her posture. "Your son," May continued, her voice dropping lower. "When he was gone, did the world feel unsafe? Did you look at every shadow and see a threat? Did you feel that if you could just enforce the rules, if you could make everything proper and orderly, you could prevent the pain from ever happening again?" Tears welled in Eleanor Albright's eyes. She fought them, her chin trembling. The armor of her righteousness was cracking, falling away to reveal the wounded mother beneath. No one had ever spoken to her of her grief so directly, so understandingly. "Sarah is not in danger from me," May said. "She is a child drowning in sadness. Her father is a man who has forgotten how to speak. This place was dying. I am not a stain. I am a mender of broken things. That is all." She paused, then added, "Your pain is a heavy thing to carry alone, Mistress Albright. I am sorry for your burden." Eleanor Albright stared at her, the tears now tracing clean paths down her dusty cheeks. She had come expecting a fight, a denial, a coarse argument. She had come to vanquish a sinner. Instead, she had been met with an empathy so profound it disarmed her completely. She saw no witch, no harlot. She saw a woman who understood the shape of her own broken heart. Without another word, she turned, walked back to her buggy, and drove away, shaken to her very core. The weapon the town had sharpened against May had just been transformed into a shield. The public climax came 2 weeks later. Carmichael, his patience exhausted, decided to foreclose. He posted a notice on the door of his bank. He would auction the assets of the Thorn Creek Ranch on the bank's steps the following Saturday to settle the outstanding debt. It was the final move in his game, played out for the whole town to see, casting himself as the long-suffering benefactor forced to take action. On Saturday morning, the town gathered. It was a spectacle. Elias Thorn stood near the steps, his face pale and grim, a man resigned to his fate. Jedediah was beside him, his one good fist clenched. At the top of the steps, Phineas Carmichael stood, radiating sorrowful regret. "My friends," he began, his voice booming with false piety, "it is with a heavy heart that I stand before you today. No man has tried harder to help Elias Thorne than I. But a debt is a debt. The bank must be made whole." He was about to signal the auctioneer when a voice, calm and clear, cut through the crowd. "The debt has been paid 3 times over." A path opened through the assembled townspeople. May walked through it. She was not dressed in her work clothes, but in her one good dress, the plain, dark poplin, clean and pressed. In her hands she carried the Thorne Ranch ledgers. She walked to the foot of the steps and faced Carmichael. "This is a private matter of business," Carmichael snapped, his trowel smile tightening at the edges. "This is a public auction of stolen goods," May countered, her voice ringing with authority. "And this is the evidence." She opened the first ledger. "Mr. Carmichael claims a debt of $900, but the ledgers tell a different story." In the stunned silence, May began to read. Calmly, methodically, she laid out the entire fraudulent scheme for all to hear. She read the dates of the phantom fee deliveries. She read the inflated costs for freight. She named the exact amounts, the exact dates, her voice never wavering. On August 10th, a charge of $40 for lumber from Mr. Carmichael's sawmill. "Jedediah, was any lumber delivered to the ranch that week?" Jedediah, startled to be addressed, straightened up. "No, ma'am, not a single plank." A murmur went through the crowd. On September 3rd, a charge for 3 tons of hay. "But the ranch's own records show the barn was full from our own harvest. The charge is a fiction." The murmur grew louder. Carmichael's face had gone from pink to a blotchy red. His smile was gone completely. "These are lies, fabrications from a conniving foreigner," he snarled, his voice losing its creamy smoothness, turning ugly and raw. "The numbers are not foreign," May said, turning a page. "They are plain, and they accuse you. You used a good man's grief and trust as a weapon against him. You smiled in his face while you picked his pocket. You are not a banker. You are a thief." "How dare you?" Carmichael bellowed, taking a step down, his face contorted with rage. He had lost his composure entirely. The mask was shattered. "A creature like you accusing me? A mannish, yellow-skinned—" He was cut off. "That is enough, Mr. Carmichael." The voice was quiet, but it cut through his tirade like a whip. Mistress Eleanor Albright stepped forward from the crowd. She stood beside May, facing the banker. Her face was calm, her back ramrod straight. "I have listened to this woman," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the square. "And I have listened to you. She speaks the truth. You speak with the tongue of a serpent." She turned to the crowd. "This man has preyed on our neighbor. He has used our own prejudice as a tool to blind us. We have been fools." It was the turning of the tide. Jedediah stepped forward, then one of the neighbors who had helped during the storm, then another. One by one, the townspeople of good conscience moved, shifting their positions until they were a silent wall standing with Elias and Jedediah and Mistress Albright behind May. They had formed a line, not of battle, but of solidarity. Carmichael looked at the sea of hardened faces, at the undeniable truth in the ledgers, at the woman who had so calmly and completely destroyed him. He was ruined. His power, built on a foundation of lies and false smiles, had crumbled to dust in a single morning. He turned wordless and fled into the sanctuary of his now despised bank. The crowd did not cheer. They simply watched him go, their silence a more profound condemnation than any shout. The auction was over before it began. 2 years passed. 2 cycles of seasons, of planting and harvesting, of thaw and freeze. The Thorn Creek Ranch was no longer a place of grief. Under May's quiet, steady guidance, it had become a showplace. The house stood straight and true, its spine mended, a fresh coat of white paint gleaming in the sun. The barns were sound, the fences were strong, and the fields were a lush, vibrant green, irrigated by water that flowed clean and abundant. It was a hidden gem, a testament to what could be rebuilt with competence and care. May was the undisputed heart of it all. She was no longer just a hired hand. She was the center of their small, found family. Sarah, no longer a silent ghost, was now a bright, chattering girl who trailed May everywhere, her small hand often tucked into May's large one. The carved bird still sat on her bedside table. Jedediah, his cynicism long since melted away, took May's word as gospel and argued her genius to anyone in town who would listen. And Eleanor Albright was her closest friend. The two women, one large and placid, one small and stern, would sit on the porch in the evenings, a comfortable silence between them that spoke of deep, mutual respect. One evening in late summer, May was sitting on that porch, watching the sun dip below the hills, painting the sky in long streaks of orange and gold. The air was warm and smelled of cut hay and contentment. She was thinking of leaving. The work was done. The place was whole. The family was healed. The pattern of her life suggested it was time to move on, before she was discarded. She had made her peace with it. Elias came and sat in the chair beside her. He was a different man from the hollowed-out ghost she had met on these same steps. The grief was still a part of him, a quiet scar, but it no longer defined him. His shoulders were straight, his eyes were clear, and he knew how to smile again. They sat in silence for a while, watching the long, gold light spill across the valley. "I remember the day you arrived," he said finally, his voice soft. "I thought you were just another drifter. I was going to send you away." He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating smile on his face. "I expected so little. I thought maybe you could help with the heavy work for a week or two. That was the whole of my vision." He turned to look at her, his expression earnest and full of a quiet wonder. "And then you cleared the ditch. You mended the doll. You faced down Carmichael. You held up the roof of the barn." He recited the list not as a record of debts, but as a litany of miracles. "You saved my daughter's life. You saved this ranch. You saved me from drowning." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "All my life I heard men talk about women as if they were delicate things, to be protected and sheltered. But Mary, my wife, she was strong. She ran this place. And you," he searched for the words, "you are the strongest person I have ever known. That bigness you carry, your strength, your stubbornness not to break. The world looks at that and calls it too much. I looked at it and was afraid of it. But I was wrong. Your too muchness was just enough to save us all." He reached over and took her hand. His was calloused and warm. Hers was large and capable. "This ranch, it's half yours by rights. More than half. I've had the papers drawn. Your name next to mine on the deed. Not as a gift, as a fact, an equal partnership." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "But that's just paper. That's just business. I'm asking you to stay, May. Not because this place needs you anymore. It does, but that's not the reason. I'm asking you to stay because we need you. Because Sarah needs you. Because I need you." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "I love you. Stay and build a life here with me. Not as a hired hand, as my partner, as my wife." May sat there, the golden light washing over her, his hand holding hers. And she felt something inside her, a thing she had carried for a lifetime, begin to fall away. It was the armor, the heavy, layered armor of silence, of a still face, of a guarded heart. It had been forged in 1,000 moments of cruelty and dismissal, 1,000 insults whispered and shouted. It had protected her, but it had also imprisoned her. Now, piece by piece, it was coming loose, falling away like dust, leaving not a void, but a quiet, tender space. The pain of being too much, of being a specimen, of being perpetually underestimated, it all receded, washed away by the simple, profound truth of his words. He had seen all of her, the whole of her, and he had not found her too much. He had found her to be enough. She turned her head and looked at him, at this good, quiet man who had learned to see. The last piece of the armor fell. For the first time in her adult life, her face was not a mask. It was just her face, and on it, a small, slow smile bloomed. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding since childhood. "Yes,"